Hey everybody, thanks for watching. We are going to take a look at the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke chapter 10. It's going to be the gospel reading for a lot of churches this coming Sunday. And as in all the other videos, we're going to look at it from an Old Testament perspective, and I'm also going to pull in a lot of first century evidence that helps us to understand this parable more fully in its original context. And it's extremely important with this particular parable because of all the parables of Jesus, this one has been ripped out of context, not understood from an Old Testament perspective, and it's been flattened down to be nothing more than a moralistic tale about how we're supposed to help other people. And it's profoundly more than that. So we're going to take a look at some Old Testament passages. We're going to take a look at the first century context. And by doing so, we're going to help to illumine how this particular parable would have been received in its first century context. So let's jump right in. It begins with a dialogue between Jesus and an expert in the law. The expert in the law stands up and he says, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" We're told that he has a sinister motive in asking this question because he's testing Jesus. He's going to test his theological credentials. So Jesus, in typical Jesus fashion, responds to the lawyer's question with a question of his own. He says, "Well, what's written in the law? How do you read it?" And the expert in the law gives an orthodox answer. He quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength." And he quotes from Leviticus 19, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus responds, "Oh, well then do that and you'll live. All you have to do is love God perfectly, love your neighbor perfectly, and you'll be saved." So he answers the law question with a law statement of his own. But of course, the expert in the law is not satisfied because he wants to know exactly how broad a definition he should have for his neighbor. He says, "Who is my neighbor?" So what he's getting at is a hotly debated question of first century Judaism. Exactly how far does our understanding of neighbor extend? So it was commonly accepted among the Jews of the first century that a neighbor was your fellow Jew. And most of them also believed that proselytes, those who had Gentiles who had come and joined the Jewish faith, were also part of the definition of neighbor. But what about Greeks? What about Samaritans? What about all those who were outside of the Jewish faith? Were they part of the neighbor that is to be loved? Well, the evidence we have from the literature of the first century says that they were not. We know from, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Qumran community. They say that the sons of light are to be loved, but the sons of darkness are to be hated. We also have statements from first century Jewish literature that eating with the Samaritan, for instance, was the equivalent of eating with pigs. So the Samaritans had a very bad reputation among the first century Jews. They were considered to be heretics. They were considered to be schismatics. And so any opinion of them on the part of the Jews was going to be a negative one. So the Samaritans would have been excluded, in other words, from the definition of neighbor. So what that lawyer is really getting at is this. So he wants to know exactly how many people, what kind of people he is to love so that he can justify himself. Because if Jesus says, well, your neighbor is your fellow Jew, he can say, well, I've loved my fellow Jew, and therefore he can feel satisfied that he is justified. But Jesus doesn't give him a direct response. Again, Jesus answers in a typical Jesus sort of way by telling a story. And you know the story pretty well. This guy is going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's a 17-mile road, and there's quite a bit of distance that you can see in front of you. That's going to become important in just a minute. But along the way, as happened a lot in that particular time, he gets attacked by a band of robbers, and they beat him up, and they strip him, and they leave him there half dead. Now that's important because his clothing are gone. He can't be identified as a Jew or Gentile. He's lying there half dead, and so you can't have a dialogue with him to find out his pattern of speech or the language he uses. So you don't know who this guy is. He's just someone in need of mercy. That's all that he is. The first character to appear to see him is a priest. Now, when we see the priest pass by on the other side, not give this guy any assistance, we think, oh, what a jerk, not going to give this guy any help. But think what's going on in the mind of the priest. Chances are he's just left a 2-week tour of duty at the Jerusalem temple. You see, the priests did not all live in Jerusalem, and they didn't work at the temple 365 days a year. The priests lived elsewhere, and they were divided into all these various groups, and when their time came up, they would journey to Jerusalem, and they would serve for 2 weeks as a priest at the temple, and then they go home. So since this guy's going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and Jericho was the city that had a lot of priests in it, he's probably just finished his 2-week stint of duty at the temple, and now he's going home to his family. He sees this guy here. Now, what risk is involved? Besides the obvious risk that maybe the robbers are still around. Well, the primary risk is one of ritual defilement. You see, the rules governing the behavior of priests were very strict. And one of those rules was that if you came into contact with a corpse, then you automatically became ritually defiled. Now, we don't know, he doesn't know if this guy is alive or dead. He probably looks like he's dead. He can't tell. So what if he walks up there and this guy is dead and he gets so close and now he's ritually defiled? Well, that means that, number one, he can't collect tithes and eat tithes anymore because now he's in a state of ritual uncleanness. Secondly, it means that he's probably going to have to turn right around and go back to Jerusalem and go through a long, complicated process to become ritually clean again. And also, because he's going to go back as one who's now ritually unclean, he's going to face shame for having made himself ritually unclean. So in the mind of the priest, he's probably saying to himself, what would a good priest do? Well, look, a good priest would have to consider his time with his family. He's on his way home, but he can't go home if he becomes ritually defiled. And he's got to consider the do's and don'ts of the religious system. He's got to put himself in the place of one who's considering the religious questions and the religious etiquette and the ritual laws of the day. And so he says to himself, what would a good priest do? A good priest would not take that risk. So in his own mind, he's justified in doing what he does. He passes him by. Now, the Levite, we always assume, just comes up later, but there's a high likelihood that the Levite actually saw what the priest did. As I mentioned earlier, it's a long road, but there's a lot of clearance on this road where you can see who's ahead of you. And travelers in the first century paid close attention to who was on the road because obviously it was a dangerous place. So there's a very good chance the Levite saw what the priest did. And so when he sees his superior, his theological, spiritual superior, a priest who is in the upper echelon of the sacred servants of Yahweh, when he sees him do what he does, the Levite probably says to himself, well, who am I to not follow the pattern set by the priest? I mean, if this guy who really knows the law and who serves God at his altar, if he didn't help the guy in need, well, then I'm certainly not going to help him in need. And so the Levite also passes by the needy man. And then we meet the third character. We meet the Samaritan. So the Samaritan is part of this heretical, schismatic group. They lived up in what was formerly the northern kingdom of Israel. The Samaritans, the origin of the Samaritans is a little bit fuzzy, but basically what happened was this. In the 8th century, when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, they took all of those people out, they exiled them, and they replaced them with peoples from other areas. And these people brought with them their own worship of gods, and sometimes they combined that worship of their God with the worship of Yahweh. They built altars to their gods. And eventually, these came to be known as the Samaritans, the people of Samaria. And they even had their own temple at Mount Gerizim. They had their own version of the Torah. They didn't accept the whole Old Testament. They only accepted the first 5 books, and even those were edited to reflect their theologies. So, for instance, they have in there that a temple was to be built at Mount Gerizim instead of the temple at Jerusalem. So, he is of that group. So when he comes up on him, he does differently than the priest and Levite, of course. He comes up to the man. He sees him there. He has mercy on him. He binds up his wounds. He pours on oil and wine. He puts the man on his own beast of burden, and then he carries him to the inn where he continues to take care of him. Now, what's going on here? Well, first of all, it's a shock that the Samaritan is included. Chances are the people listening to the parable would have expected the third character not to be a Samaritan, but to be a lay Israelite. The typical threefold pattern of Israel was considered the priests, the Levites, and the regular Israelite. So when they were listening to the story that Jesus told, they probably thought the third character was going to be one like them, a lay Israelite. But Jesus changes things. He puts a Samaritan in there. And the Samaritan does godlike things. And this is where the Old Testament comes in very handy. If you look at Hosea chapter 6, read it. It's only 11 verses. There's 10 or 12 phrases in Hosea 6 that reflect the same language of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Language such as binding up and pouring on and a band of robbers and priests who are doing wicked things. So if you compare the language of Hosea chapter 6 with what's happening here in the parable of the Good Samaritan, you see that Jesus is drawing upon this language to tell the story. And what's amazing is that the actions of binding up and pouring on and healing in Hosea chapter 6 are ascribed to God. So what the Samaritan is doing to this wounded man are God-like actions, which of course is why one of the traditional interpretations of the parable of the Good Samaritan is that Christ himself is the Good Samaritan, that particular character is a Christological character, that Christ is the one who comes and does these things for us, just like the Samaritan does God-like things in helping this wounded man. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's an Old Testament narrative that provides a bit of a background to this story. So if you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 28, you have, especially in verse 15, 2 Chronicles 28 verse 15, you have in narrative form, I think, the source from which Jesus draws this particular parable. Here's what happened. So the northern kingdom, the people of Samaria, attacked the people of the south, and they brought back thousands of captives, men, some women and children. And along the way, a prophet stopped them and said that if they were to bring their brothers and sisters as captives, that they would be invoking the wrath of God upon them. So 4 men of the people of Samaria, they go out and they help these people who had been taken captive. It says that they clothed them, they gave them sandals, they gave them food and drink, they anointed them, they placed the weak upon their mounts, and they brought them to the city of Jericho. 2 Chronicles 28 verse 15, I think, is the core narrative from which Jesus then builds his own story, this parable of the Good Samaritan. So this parable as a whole is presenting to us this picture of how God reverses things. He doesn't take the priest or the Levite. He doesn't take the upper echelon of the Israelite society and hold them up as a model. Instead, he reverses everything, and he has the Samaritan, the one who's rejected, the one who's an outsider, the one who's an outcast, the one who's hated, and he makes him the hero of the story because he's the one who shows mercy. He's the one who binds up. He's the one who pours on oil wine. He's the one who places the wounded man on his beast and brings him to the inn in Jericho. So he's a Christological kind of character. He's the one who extends mercy to the one in need. And of course, at the end of the parable, when Jesus resumes his dialogue with this expert in the law, he shows him that what matters is not who your neighbor is, but how you are a neighbor to those who are in need. So the neighbor is the one who shows mercy. The neighbor is the one like the Samaritan. And ultimately the neighbor is Christ because he's the one who shows mercy to us. He's the one who finds us beaten up and left half dead and unable to help ourselves. And he's the one who does all of the verbs of healing, of restoring, of paying, of doing everything necessary to make sure that in the end we are okay because we are cared for by the one who extends divine mercy to us. Now this video was a little bit longer than the rest of them that I made, so hopefully you've stuck with me, and hopefully that you've learned a little bit more about the parable of the Good Samaritan from an Old Testament and from a first century perspective. And as always, thanks for listening, and I pray that this Sunday as you hear this particular reading and hear it preached that you'll be able to understand a little bit more about what's going on here. So thanks for listening and have a great week. Appreciate it.